Arthur had always found comfort in the quiet of the cemetery. The world beyond the wrought iron gates was noisy, unpredictable, and full of problems he preferred not to face. But here, among the weathered tombstones and the silent, well-kept paths, everything had an order, a finality. The dead did not complain, and their resting places, once tended to, stayed that way. That afternoon, a soft drizzle fell over the town as Arthur watched the gravediggers lower the coffin of Mrs. Agnes Bellamy into the earth. She had been an old woman, one of the last of her generation. Her funeral had been a small affair. No flowers, no music, and only a handful of mourners. The man who stood nearest the grave was a nephew, or so Arthur had heard. He didn't cry or speak during the service, just stared blankly as the coffin disappeared beneath the dirt. Once the priest said the final words, the man left without saying a single word to anyone. Arthur leaned on his shovel as the gravediggers finished filling in the hole. He would come back later to smooth the earth and tidy the grave. It was his routine, and Arthur liked routines. They kept the world manageable. He returned to his cottage just beyond the cemetery gates as dusk settled over the headstones. His home was modest, but comfortable, with a small garden in the back and windows that faced the cemetery. Most people in the town thought it was strange that he lived so close to his work, but Arthur didn't mind. It was a peaceful place, and in the evenings, he would sit on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the mist rise between the tombstones as the sun set. That night, however, something was different. Arthur couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him during Mrs. Bellamy's funeral. There had been something off about the whole thing. The absence of real grief, the coldness of the nephew. He chalked it up to the rain and tried to push the thoughts aside. He had been at this job for almost 20 years. People grieved in their own way. It wasn't for him to judge. After a simple dinner, Arthur settled into his armchair by the window, letting the soft patter of rain lull him into relaxation. He had just begun to doze off when a soft, persistent knock at the window startled him awake. Arthur frowned. No one ever came to his house at this hour. He stood, setting his tea on the table, and moved toward the window. The knock came again, louder this time. Peering through the rain-smeared glass, Arthur saw a figure standing just beyond the window. His breath caught in his throat. It was Mrs. Bellamy. She stood there in the mist, her form barely illuminated by the weak glow of his porch light. Her hair was still neatly curled as it had been during the funeral, and she wore the same modest dress. But there was something off about her eyes. Empty, hollow, and fixed on him. Arthur blinked rapidly, stepping back from the window. This had to be some kind of trick. His mind was playing games with him. Mrs. Bellamy was dead, buried just hours ago. He looked again, hoping she would be gone. She wasn't. "Go away," he whispered, though he didn't believe she could hear him. The figure of Mrs. Bellamy didn't move. She just stared, her mouth closed in an expressionless line. Arthur's heart raced, and for a moment, he felt the urge to fling open the door and demand to know what was happening. But some deep, primal instinct held him back. He couldn't open that door. He shouldn't open that door? Arthur didn't sleep that night. He sat in his armchair, staring at the curtains, waiting for something else to happen. But the house remained still, save for the ticking of the clock and the occasional gust of wind against the windows. Hours passed, and by the time dawn broke over the cemetery, Arthur had convinced himself it had all been a nightmare. He went about his day as usual, returning to Mrs. Bellamy's grave to tidy the soil and adjust the headstone. The sun was shining, the ground still damp from the rain, and everything looked as it should. There was no sign of the strange encounter from the night before, no evidence that anything unusual had happened at all. But that night, as Arthur sat by his window, the knock came again. This time, when he looked, there was another figure, a man, someone he had buried years ago. Arthur's throat tightened, and he turned away from the window, refusing to look any closer. The dead were coming to him, and he didn't know why. Arthur didn't speak about the strange encounters. Who would believe him, anyway? A cemetery caretaker claiming to see the dead rising from their graves? He imagined the townspeople chuckling behind his back, shaking their heads at poor Arthur, who's been around the dead for too long. But it was getting harder to ignore. On the third night, he sat stiffly in his armchair, pretending to read the paper, though his eyes never moved across the page. The rain had returned, as it always seemed to when things went wrong. He knew, deep down, that it would happen again. That knock, that cold, unsettling knock on the window. It came, a soft, slow rapping on the glass. This time, he didn't flinch. His pulse quickened, but he swallowed the knot in his throat and stood. Whatever this was, whatever they were, he needed to understand it. He needed to face it. As he moved toward the window, the knocking came again, sharper this time. He parted the curtains just enough to peer out, steeling himself for whatever awaited him. There, standing in the rain, was the ghost of a man. Arthur recognized him immediately. Gregory Thompson, a gruff middle-aged man who had died in an accident 5 years ago. He had slipped from the roof of his house while fixing a leak, and Arthur had buried him shortly afterward. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Gregory. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but there was no malice in his expression, only sadness. Unlike the previous nights, Gregory did not stand still. He raised a hand slowly, beckoning Arthur closer. Arthur shook his head, whispering under his breath, "No, I can't." But Gregory's gesture grew more insistent. His hollow eyes locked on Arthur's. There was no anger in them, just a deep, unsettling sadness. He didn't want to harm Arthur. He wanted something else. Against every instinct screaming at him to stop, Arthur grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The cold rain hit his face as he crossed the short distance between his cottage and the figure of Gregory, who hadn't moved. As Arthur approached, Gregory's mouth opened, though no sound emerged at first. It was as though the ghost was struggling to speak after years of silence. Arthur shivered, not just from the rain, but from the uncanny sight of the man he had buried 5 years ago, standing before him, broken and incomplete. Finally, Gregory's voice broke through the stillness, raspy and low, as if the effort to speak pained him. "You must find her," Gregory whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Arthur blinked, confused. "Find who?" Gregory's mouth opened again, and this time Arthur saw something truly unsettling. His breath cold and visible, as though he were still alive. The ghost pointed toward the cemetery, toward a distant corner shrouded in mist. "Elizabeth, my daughter. She never knew. Tell her." "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, and Arthur's mind reeled. Gregory had never spoken of a daughter, at least not during the few conversations Arthur had with him before his death. But the man was insistent, his pale finger still pointing toward the far side of the cemetery. Arthur turned to follow the ghost's gesture, staring at the shadow graves in the distance. When he looked back, Gregory was gone. Arthur stood there in the rain for a long moment, his heart racing and his mind swirling with questions. Find her? His daughter? What was he sorry for? It felt wrong, too surreal to be real, but the image of Gregory standing in the rain, pleading with him, was burned into his mind. This was no dream. The next morning, Arthur found himself back at Gregory's grave. He stood over the worn headstone, replaying the ghost's words in his head. "Tell her I'm sorry, Elizabeth." He didn't have much information to go on, but Arthur knew enough about the town to find out more. He spent the afternoon at the local records office, thumbing through old files and records. Sure enough, after some digging, he found Gregory's daughter, Elizabeth Thompson, now Elizabeth Parker, who had moved away from the town shortly after her father's death. Arthur hesitated before picking up the phone to call her. How could he explain this without sounding insane? But he didn't have a choice, not if he wanted to stop these visits. With trembling hands, he dialed the number listed in the records. The phone rang several times before a soft voice answered. "Hello? Elizabeth Parker?" Arthur asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes, who's speaking?" "My name is Arthur. I was the cemetery caretaker when your father, Gregory Thompson, passed away." There was a long pause on the other end, and Arthur could feel Elizabeth's hesitation. "I see. Is there something I can help you with?" "I don't know how to say this," Arthur stammered, the words catching in his throat. "But your father, he wanted me to tell you something." "What?" Elizabeth's voice sounded puzzled, but she was still listening. He wanted to say he was sorry," Arthur said, the words sounding strange even to him. "He said you never knew and that he was sorry." There was silence on the line, and Arthur feared she would hang up. But when Elizabeth spoke again, her voice was choked with emotion. I never got to say goodbye," she whispered. We hadn't spoken in years. I didn't even go to his funeral. He left us, my mother and me. I never understood why." Arthur closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Gregory's request settle over him. "I don't know what happened, but he seemed to regret it, Elizabeth. He wanted you to know." For a long time, there was only the sound of Elizabeth's quiet sobbing on the other end of the line. Arthur didn't say anything more. What else could he say? After a few moments, she thanked him softly and hung up. Arthur sat there, staring at the phone in his hand. He didn't know if it would be enough to bring Gregory peace, but he had done as the ghost had asked. That night, there was no knock at the window, but Arthur didn't feel relieved, only unsettled. The ghosts weren't going to stop. Arthur had thought, hoped, that after Gregory's ghost disappeared, things might return to normal. But the cemetery was not going to let him go that easily. In the days following his strange encounter with Gregory Thompson, Arthur went about his work with growing unease. The weight of what had happened gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He was right. It began with small things. He'd catch glimpses of movement at the edges of the cemetery, shadows that seemed to flicker and disappear as soon as he turned his head. Sometimes, while digging or tending to the graves, he'd hear faint whispers carried on the wind. At first, Arthur told himself it was his imagination. Nothing more than tricks his mind was playing on him after the strange visitations. But soon, the knock came again. This time, it was 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the window. Arthur had been trying to distract himself with work, reorganizing the dusty shelves in his tiny cottage. The sound startled him, though it was not unexpected. His heart sank as he set down the box of tools and slowly walked toward the window. Another figure stood outside, waiting. Arthur's pulse quickened as he recognized her. Margaret Keene, an elderly woman who had passed away just a month ago. He had attended her funeral himself. She had been well-liked in town, a sweet old woman who always baked cookies for the local children. Seeing her now, pale, transparent, and staring at him through the window, turned Arthur's stomach. Just like before, the ghost didn't move. Her hollow eyes followed Arthur as he hesitated by the window, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to turn away, to ignore her and hope she'd vanish on her own. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't happen. The ghosts wouldn't leave him in peace. He stepped outside into the cold night air, feeling the chill sink into his bones. Margaret stood just beyond his porch, her figure barely visible in the fog rolling in from the cemetery. Arthur approached cautiously, his breath fogging in the air. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" Her lips moved slowly, as though forming words was a difficult task. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and cracked, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Please, my locket." "Find it." Arthur blinked, confused. "Your locket?" You mean the one you always wore? Margaret nodded slowly, her hand lifting to her throat where the locket had once hung. It was stolen from me. I cannot rest until it's returned. Arthur felt a surge of disbelief. A stolen locket? Of all the things a ghost might ask for, this seemed almost trivial. But Margaret's expression was one of deep sorrow, and Arthur could feel the desperation radiating from her. For her, this was no small thing. It was everything. He swallowed hard, nodding. I'll find it for you. I'll make sure it's returned. As soon as the words left his mouth, Margaret's figure faded into the fog. Arthur stood there for a long time, his mind racing. A stolen locket? Who would steal something from a kind old woman like Margaret? He had to find out. If this was what it took to stop the ghost from coming, he'd do it. The next morning, Arthur went to Margaret's house, which had been left vacant since her death. The property was locked up, but Arthur knew the neighbors well. He knocked on the door of Mrs. Henderson, Margaret's next-door neighbor, who had been close to her in life. Arthur? Mrs. Henderson greeted him with a surprised smile. What brings you here? I was wondering if you could help me, Arthur said, glancing toward Margaret's house. Did Margaret ever mention her locket to you? The one she always wore? Mrs. Henderson's smile faded slightly. A locket? Yes, she wore it all the time. It was a keepsake from her husband. God rest his soul. But after she passed, well, no one could find it. We all thought she must have misplaced it, but Arthur's brow furrowed. Misplaced? You don't think someone could have taken it? The older woman hesitated, looking uncomfortable. I didn't want to believe it. But there were a lot of people in and out of her house after she passed. It could have easily gone missing. There were a few, let's just say, less than honorable relatives who were quick to sift through her things. Arthur clenched his jaw, anger rising in his chest. Stealing from the dead. It was a violation of everything he stood for as the cemetery caretaker. But there was no time to dwell on it. He needed to get the locket back, and fast. Do you know who was there? Arthur asked, his voice low. Mrs. Henderson nodded reluctantly. Her nephew, Peter, was one of the first. He always had a bit of a reputation for being, well, greedy. If anyone took it, I bet it was him. That night, after asking around town, Arthur tracked Peter down at the local bar. The man was in his 30s, with slick-back hair and a permanent smirk that made Arthur's skin crawl. He watched from the corner as Peter laughed with his friends, unaware of the conversation heading his way. Arthur approached the man, his body tense. Peter. Peter looked up, clearly surprised to see Arthur standing over him. Hey, caretaker, what brings you here? Bit late for cemetery work, isn't it? Arthur didn't waste any time with pleasantries. Margaret's locket, where is it? Peter's smile faltered for a moment, but then he chuckled, shaking his head. Locket? What are you talking about? You were at her house after the funeral, Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. You took it, didn't you? Peter's smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a look of irritation. Listen, old man, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't take anything. Arthur's patience snapped. I don't care what you think. I'm not leaving until you give it back. For a moment, Peter seemed ready to argue, but something in Arthur's eyes made him reconsider. He glanced around nervously before reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, tarnished locket. He tossed it onto the table carelessly. Fine, take it. Wasn't worth anything anyway. Arthur snatched the locket from the table, disgusted by the man's casual dismissal. He didn't say another word as he left the bar, clutching the locket tightly in his fist. That night, back at his cottage, Arthur held the locket in his hands and whispered into the quiet, hoping Margaret's ghost could hear him. I found it. It's yours again. There was no response, no ghostly figure, no knock on the window, just silence. But Arthur knew she was at peace now. For the first time in days, he slept without interruption. Yet as he drifted off, a chilling thought crossed his mind. This was only the beginning. The cemetery held more secrets, more unfinished business, and the dead would not stop coming until he fulfilled his new role as their messenger. Arthur thought things might calm down after fulfilling Margaret's request, but the dead had other plans. The knocking didn't stop. Each night, it returned, more insistent and aggressive. The ghosts weren't just asking, they were demanding. And with every knock came a new figure, a new request, each one more troubling than the last. Arthur felt the strain creeping into every aspect of his life. His work at the cemetery became a blur of graves, whispers, and shadows moving in his peripheral vision. He could no longer walk the grounds without feeling watched by both the dead and the living. The townspeople, though polite, had started to notice his growing unease. He wasn't as careful with his appearance, his movements more hurried, his once quiet demeanor frayed at the edges. But worse than all of this was the growing sense that something was lurking beneath the surface. Something more sinister than the individual requests from the ghosts. The cemetery, a place he had once found peaceful, now felt oppressive. The weight of the earth, the presence of the dead, seemed to press down on him more heavily than before. Arthur began to question why this was happening. Why him? Why now? One night, Arthur sat in his armchair, exhausted from another long day of trying to meet the dead's demands. His eyes fluttered shut, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to drift into the edge of sleep. The knock came again. This time, harder. Arthur shot upright, the familiar sense of dread washing over him. But this time, something was different. The air felt thick, almost stifling, and the room was unnaturally cold. As he stood to approach the window, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, as if something was standing behind him. He turned, and for the briefest of moments, he saw it. A shadow, darker than the night, lurking in the corner of the room. Arthur froze, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, and the shadow was gone. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. With a deep breath, Arthur pulled back the curtains to reveal yet another ghost. This one was unfamiliar to him. A young man, no older than 30, with a gaunt, haunted expression. His clothes were tattered, and his eyes were wide with panic, as if he had just died moments ago. Arthur's pulse quickened. The ghost pointed to the cemetery, his mouth moving as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Arthur leaned closer to the window, straining to hear the silent words, but all he could make out was a desperate, soundless plea. "Tell me what you need," Arthur whispered, though the ghost could not hear him. The ghost's eyes flickered toward the graveyard again, then back to Arthur, his face twisted in anguish. And just like that, he was gone. Arthur stood at the window, feeling more shaken than ever. He had fulfilled the requests of the dead before, but this was different. The silence, the shadow he had seen inside his home, the ghost's expression, it all felt wrong. Something was shifting, and Arthur couldn't quite grasp what it was. The dead were not just restless. They were afraid. The next day, Arthur found himself wandering deeper into the cemetery than he usually did. His feet carried him to the farthest corner, where the older, forgotten graves lay. Many of the headstones were worn smooth by time, their names barely legible. Few visitors came here. Most of these people had long been forgotten by the living, but Arthur could feel their presence nonetheless. As he approached one particular grave, an old, weathered stone with no visible name, the air grew colder, and a strange sense of unease washed over him. He hesitated, staring at the unmarked grave, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. "Arthur," a voice whispered. Arthur's heart leapt into his throat. He spun around, but no one was there. The voice had been soft, almost distant, but unmistakably real. It was not the voice of a ghost he had encountered before. It was something else, something that sent a chill down his spine. "Arthur," the voice came again, this time closer. His hand shook as he turned back to the grave, staring at the empty patch of earth in front of him. He felt an overwhelming urge to dig, to unearth whatever was buried beneath. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. There was something dark lurking in the cemetery, and Arthur wasn't ready to face it. That night, the knocking didn't come. Instead, Arthur sat in his armchair, staring at the empty corner of the room where he had seen the shadow the night before. The silence weighed heavily on him, but the absence of the ghost knocks was not a relief. It felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, just out of sight. Sleep did not come easily, and when Arthur finally drifted off, he was plagued by nightmares. He dreamt of graves opening, of hands reaching out from the earth to pull him down into the darkness. The shadowy figure appeared again in his dream, standing over him, whispering his name in a voice that made his skin crawl. Arthur woke in a cold sweat, his heart racing. The room was still, but the sense of dread lingered. The next day, as he returned to the cemetery, he found something that made his blood run cold. One of the graves, the unmarked one from the far corner, had been disturbed. The earth had been churned up, as if someone or something had clawed its way out from beneath. Arthur stood frozen, staring at the disturbed ground, the implications washing over him like a tidal wave. The ghosts were not the only ones trapped in the cemetery. Something else was here, something darker, and it had been watching him all along. Arthur's days had grown increasingly fragmented, divided between the living and the dead. He no longer felt like the same man who once found solace in the quiet of the cemetery. Now, every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Every breath of wind whispered names he didn't want to hear. The town, with its friendly neighbors and routine chatter, had become an illusion, masking the deeper, darker history buried beneath its quaint surface. The disturbed grave in the far corner of the cemetery haunted him. He had avoided it for days, afraid of what he might find if he dug deeper. But something had to be done. The ghosts were coming more frequently, their requests now tinged with urgency. But their presence no longer felt like the biggest threat. There was something more sinister lurking just beyond their reach, something tied to the cemetery itself. He could feel it watching him, waiting for him to uncover the truth. Arthur decided to visit the town's archives. He knew that if the cemetery held secrets, the old records might hold the key to understanding what was happening. He needed to know what was buried beneath the unmarked graves, to understand why the dead were coming to him in greater numbers. And most importantly, why they seemed afraid. The archive building was as old as the town itself, filled with dusty records and yellowed papers that smelled of mildew. Arthur found himself speaking to Mr. Fitzpatrick, the town's elderly librarian, who had been overseeing the archives for as long as Arthur could remember. "Unmarked graves, you say?" Fitzpatrick peered over his reading glasses, his eyes narrowing as he pulled out a thick, weathered book from one of the shelves. "The old cemetery records haven't been touched in years. Hardly anyone cares about those plots anymore. People forget." Arthur nodded, tension knotting in his stomach. "I've noticed some disturbances in the cemetery. Graves I can't explain. Unmarked ones." Fitzpatrick's expression grew serious. "There are reasons those graves are unmarked. Some families didn't want their names remembered. Others were just lost to time. But there are a few that were deliberately forgotten." He flipped through the pages of the book, his fingers tracing faded ink and brittle paper. "Here it is. You're asking about the far corner of the cemetery, yes? That area was once reserved for the unwanted." Arthur frowned. Unwanted? Criminals. People who were associated with dark dealings. They didn't get the same kind of burial as the others. Some weren't even given proper rights. The town preferred not to speak of them. A cold chill ran down Arthur's spine. What kind of dealings? Fitzpatrick's voice lowered. Superstition mostly, but there were rumors. Witchcraft, curses, even pacts with darker forces. This town has a long memory, even if people pretend to forget. Arthur stared at the book, his heart pounding. It all made sense now. The unease, the dark presence, the unnatural disturbances. The cemetery wasn't just a resting place for the dead. It was a prison for those who had been tied to something evil. Fitzpatrick glanced at him, his expression grave. If you're dealing with anything out there, Arthur, I'd be careful. Some things are best left buried. Arthur thanked him and left the archives, the weight of Fitzpatrick's words pressing down on him. As he made his way back to the cemetery, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had already been uncovered, something that was growing stronger. That night, the knocking returned, but it was more frantic than before. Arthur approached the window, expecting to see another ghost waiting for him, but the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. A crowd of them, dozens of ghosts, stood outside his house, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They were not as patient as the others had been. Their faces were twisted in desperation, their mouths moving soundlessly as they pressed closer to his window. Arthur's heart raced. He backed away from the window, nearly tripping over the chair behind him. This was too much. He had thought he could help them one by one, but now they were coming all at once, as if time was running out. For them and for him. In a panic, Arthur grabbed his coat and headed for the door. But the moment his hand touched the doorknob, the air in the room seemed to freeze. A sharp, cold wind whipped through the house, though no window was open. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he saw it again. The shadow. It was no longer just a flicker in the corner of his eye. This time, it stood in the center of the room, towering over him, a mass of darkness that seemed to absorb all light. Arthur could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on him like an invisible hand choking the air from his lungs. The ghosts outside were still there, but they no longer seemed as frightening in comparison. They had come to him for help, but this thing was here to take something from him. Arthur stumbled backward, feeling the crushing weight of the entity's presence. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its mere existence filled the room with a suffocating dread. Arthur knew instinctively that this was what had been lurking all along. The ghosts had feared this presence just as much as he did. The cemetery had been hiding it, locking it away, but something had disturbed the balance, and now it was loose. Summoning all his courage, Arthur forced himself to speak. "What do you want?" The shadow shifted, and for the first time, Arthur heard its voice. A low, rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You awakened me." Arthur's blood ran cold. "I didn't. You dug where you shouldn't have. You helped them, but now you will pay the price." Arthur's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had thought he was helping the dead find peace, but in doing so, he had unknowingly disturbed something far darker. This shadow, this entity, had been waiting for someone, anyone, to give it a foothold, and now it had latched onto him. The room seemed to shrink as the shadow loomed over him. Arthur could feel its pull, like a black hole drawing him in. He tried to move, but his legs felt rooted to the ground, frozen in place by the sheer terror coursing through him. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow receded, fading into the corners of the room once more. The air seemed to warm, and the oppressive weight lifted. Arthur gasped for breath, collapsing onto the floor, his body trembling. The knocking at the window had stopped. The ghosts were gone. Arthur lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. He had uncovered something that should have remained hidden, something that had been buried with the unmarked graves. And now, whatever it was coming for him. Arthur could barely sleep anymore. Even during the day, the weight of what he had uncovered, what he had awakened, pressed down on him. The shadow that had loomed in his home was no longer just a presence. It was growing, strengthening, and Arthur felt it stalking him with every step. But now he knew this wasn't just about the ghosts who had come to him for help. They had been trapped, bound to the cemetery because of something much older, something tied to the cursed ground. Arthur's mind was a whirl of fractured memories, fearful glimpses of the spirits he had helped and the sinister shadow that now haunted him. It wasn't until the next knock came, one that he had both dreaded and expected, that everything fell into place. This time, it wasn't just a ghost waiting for him. It was her. Arthur had thought he would never see her again. Molly Sinclair, the woman he had once loved, stood on his porch, her figure bathed in the pale moonlight. She had died tragically over a decade ago, and Arthur had buried her himself, a duty he had never recovered from emotionally. He had never forgiven himself for not saving her. And now here she was, her eyes filled with the same sorrow he remembered from their final moments together. Arthur's knees nearly buckled. Molly? She didn't move, didn't speak, but her expression told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just another request. This was the final request. Arthur opened the door and stepped onto the porch, his heart pounding in his chest. His hand shook as he reached out to her, but he knew deep down that she was beyond his touch. His voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "What do you need me to do?" Molly's eyes flickered with pain, and she finally spoke, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the night wind. "You have to finish it, Arthur. You have to put them to rest. All of them." Arthur swallowed hard. "How? I've tried to help. I've done everything I can, but—" "The shadow." Molly shook her head, her form flickering like a dying flame. "It's not just the shadow. It's what's buried beneath the cemetery. The curse, it's what binds them all. You have to destroy it. Free them from this place." Arthur's mind raced. "But how? I don't even know what it is." Molly's gaze shifted to the far corner of the cemetery, the same spot where Arthur had first felt the darkness. "The unmarked grave. It's there, Arthur. The source of it all. You have to finish it before it finishes you." Her words echoed in his mind as she began to fade, her presence growing weaker by the second. Arthur felt an overwhelming sense of loss, as though he were losing her all over again. He reached out, desperate to hold on, but she was already gone, leaving him alone with the weight of her request. Arthur stood on the porch for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness that surrounded the cemetery. His mind was made up. He couldn't run from this any longer. The ghosts had come to him for help, but the true source of their suffering, the curse that had bound them to the cemetery, had to be destroyed. And Arthur knew exactly where to start. The night was darker than usual as Arthur crossed the cemetery grounds. The wind howled through the gravestones, and the air was thick with an unnatural chill. His flashlight flickered as he made his way to the far corner of the cemetery, where the unmarked graves lay. The graves of the unwanted, as Fitzpatrick had called them. The ones tied to the dark dealings of the past. As Arthur approached the disturbed grave, his heart pounded in his chest. The earth here was different. It felt wrong, as if the ground itself was rejecting what lay beneath. The unmarked headstone loomed before him, and Arthur could feel the shadow's presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to make a move. His breath was shallow as he knelt before the grave, his hands trembling as he began to dig. The soil was cold and heavy, almost as though it were fighting against him. But Arthur kept going, driven by Molly's words, by the knowledge that this was the only way to put an end to the curse. The deeper he dug, the stronger the shadow became. Arthur could feel it pressing down on him, trying to stop him from reaching whatever was buried beneath. His muscles ached, his lungs burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not now. Finally, his shovel struck something hard. Arthur dropped to his knees, brushing the dirt away with his hands. His fingers scraped against wood, an old, rotting box, buried deep within the cursed earth. It was a coffin, but not like any Arthur had ever seen before. The wood was blackened, scorched, and the air around it seemed to pulse with dark energy. His heart raced as he forced the lid open, the creaking of the hinges echoing through the night. Inside lay a small, twisted figure, a dried corpse wrapped in decaying cloth, its face contorted in eternal anguish. But this wasn't just any corpse. This was the source of the curse, the entity that had bound the cemetery and its spirits in darkness for so long. An ancient practitioner of dark magic. One of the very souls buried in secret by the town to hide the evil deeds of the past. Arthur recoiled in horror, but he knew what had to be done. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a vial of holy water he had taken from the church, along with an old iron dagger. He wasn't a religious man, but he knew that the items carried enough symbolic weight to disrupt whatever dark power remained. With a steady hand, he poured the holy water over the dried corpse and plunged the dagger deep into its chest. The effect was immediate. The ground shook beneath him, and a deafening roar filled the air as the shadow that had haunted him for weeks erupted from the grave, twisting and writhing in the air like a living storm. Arthur was thrown back, his body hitting the cold earth as the dark entity lashed out, its form unraveling in the night. But Arthur didn't move. He lay there, watching as the shadow fought against the holy water's purifying power, its form slowly disintegrating into nothingness. The ghosts that had once crowded his home began to appear around him, their faces filled with relief, their bodies shimmering as the curse began to lift. One by one, the spirits vanished into the night, finally free. Arthur lay on the ground, his chest heaving, his mind numb. It was over. The curse was broken. The cemetery would return to what it was meant to be, a place of rest for the dead. But as he lay there, staring up at the night sky, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The ghosts were gone, the shadow was vanquished, but the cemetery would always be a part of him now. He had been their caretaker, and now he was something more. Arthur awoke on the cold, damp earth, the remnants of the shadow's roar still ringing faintly in his ears. The night sky above him was calm now, dotted with stars. The cemetery had fallen into a deep silence, so quiet it felt unnatural. The familiar presence of the spirits was gone. No more knocking, no more whispers carried by the wind. It was as though the air had been cleansed of the weight it had borne for so long. He slowly sat up, every muscle aching from the night's ordeal. His hands trembled as they brushed dirt from his clothes, his mind still reeling from what he had done. The twisted, blackened box lay shattered beside him, its contents obliterated by the holy water and the iron blade. The curse was broken. The spirits were free, but Arthur wasn't. As he stood, the full weight of the night's events came crashing down on him. He had freed the ghosts, completed his task as their caretaker, but the cemetery didn't feel like the place of peace it should have become. Instead, it felt hollow, like a vast, empty void where something crucial was missing. The darkness may have been lifted, but a heavy emptiness had taken its place, and Arthur was at the center of it. His footsteps echoed through the cemetery as he made his way back toward his cottage. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the cemetery itself were reluctant to let him leave. He had been a part of this place for so long, and now, in its eerie silence, it felt like it had claimed him. The ghosts were gone, but Arthur remained, forever tied to the soil and the secrets he had unearthed. As he approached his cottage, a strange sense of finality settled over him. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now stood like a relic of the past, filled with memories of the nights the ghosts had come to him, seeking his help. He hesitated at the door, unsure if he even belonged there anymore. His hand rested on the doorknob, and for a fleeting moment, Arthur thought of walking away, leaving the cemetery behind for good, abandoning his role as caretaker and seeking a new life far from this haunted place. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. Deep down, he knew there was no escape. This place, with its dark history and cursed ground, had become a part of him. Inside, the house was still. Arthur moved through the rooms in silence, feeling the absence of the spirits more acutely than he had expected. The shadows that had once made his home their gathering place were gone, but so was the uneasy life he had led for years. Without the requests, the knocks, the whispers in the night, Arthur felt unmoored, adrift in a world that had moved on without him. Sitting in his familiar armchair by the window, Arthur stared out at the cemetery. He expected to feel relief, but instead, a sense of dread began to creep into his thoughts. He had done what the ghosts had asked of him. He had freed them from their torment, but at what cost? The shadow was gone, yes, but the cemetery was no ordinary place. Its connection to the past ran deep, and something told him the darkness had not been vanquished. It had simply shifted. Hours passed as Arthur sat, lost in thought, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The morning sun cast long shadows across the graves, painting the cemetery in hues of gold and gray. The silence, which had once seemed peaceful, now felt ominous. The sense of finality weighed on him like a stone in his chest. But then, just as Arthur was about to rise from his chair, something caught his eye. A figure in the distance. His heart skipped a beat as he squinted into the early light. It was too far away to make out clearly, but there was no mistaking the shape of a person standing among the headstones, unmoving. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as the familiar dread returned, stronger than before. No, it couldn't be. He stood, moving closer to the window, his pulse quickening as the figure began to take shape. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark, simple clothes. For a moment, Arthur thought it might be another ghost, someone he hadn't freed. But then, the figure raised a hand in a silent wave, a gesture that sent a chill down Arthur's spine. The figure began to walk toward the cottage, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. Arthur backed away from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure's presence felt familiar, yet wrong. Like a memory twisted into something unrecognizable, and then it hit him. It was him. The man walking toward the cottage was Arthur. The realization struck like a blow to the chest. Arthur stood frozen, watching in horror as his doppelganger approached, his expression blank and unreadable. The man moved with the same gait, the same posture, the same weary steps that Arthur had taken for years as the caretaker of the cemetery. But this wasn't just a reflection. It was something else entirely. Arthur stumbled back, his mind racing. The shadow had been destroyed, but something darker, something more personal, had been set in motion. He had become a part of the cemetery, more deeply entwined with its curse than he had realized. As the doppelganger reached the front steps of the cottage, Arthur felt a wave of cold wash over him. His legs gave way, and he collapsed into the armchair, staring helplessly at the door. The figure reached for the doorknob, mirroring Arthur's movements from earlier, and twisted it slowly. The door creaked open. Arthur's breath hitched as his eyes locked with the doppelganger's. The man, his reflection, stepped inside, moving with eerie calm. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Arthur. Instead, he simply walked past him, moving through the house as if it were his own. Arthur's heart raced as he watched the figure disappear into the back room, the same room where he had seen the shadow so many times before. But this wasn't a shadow. It was something far more insidious. It was him. The truth sank in like a heavy stone. Arthur had freed the spirits, but in doing so, he had taken their place. The cemetery needed a caretaker, and now it had found one. Arthur stood, his body moving on instinct. He walked to the door, his legs heavy, and stepped outside. The morning sun was rising, casting long shadows over the graves, and Arthur knew, without a doubt, that he would never leave this place again. He was the cemetery's new keeper, bound to the land, tied to the souls who had once come to him for help. And now he would wait, just as they had, for the next visitor, the next caretaker. The cycle had begun again. Weeks later, a new caretaker arrived at the cemetery. A young man, unfamiliar with the town's history, eager to take on the quiet job of tending to the graves. He had heard about the old caretaker, Arthur, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. Disappeared without a trace, they said. On his first night in the cottage, the new caretaker sat by the window, watching the cemetery in the fading light, and then he heard it. A soft knock at the window. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales and deep dives into the mysteries of folklore and the supernatural. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the story. Feel free to share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.